Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. This is a great opportunity, and I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to Bo and Trey and Alex and Jim and everybody else who's part of the Mount Vernon and the FUS team who's made it possible for me to be here today, and especially to our friends in the back at the booth who've made all this amazing technology possible. So thank you all. It's great to be here. So the idea or the topic that I want to talk to you about today is something that others have introduced on the stage already, so I hope to be picking up on some themes. But in particular, I'm going to be speaking about this notion of empowering young people to shape their worlds through design and making. And I'd like to talk about this topic in a very specific way, and it's in a way that enters through a particular research project, which is called Agency by Design. So the Agency by Design Research Initiative is a project that started in Project Zero in 2012 when a Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area Foundation came to us, and they were called the Abundance Foundation. And they were curious about how making, or the maker movement, which they saw happening all around them out in the Bay Area, how that could be incorporated into education and what we might learn or benefit from doing that. So we were excited by this. And we developed this research initiative that we said was an exploration of the promises, practices, and pedagogies of what we were calling then maker-centered learning. So in other words, promises. We wanted to know what was good or beneficial about this work beyond the hype that we were reading in the popular press. And then practices and pedagogies. We wanted to know, well, what were educators that were doing this work engaged in doing? What were their practices like in their classrooms, and what could we learn from them? So the result of this initial study was a framework, a pedagogical framework for maker-centered learning that could be found in this book that's called Maker-Centered Learning, Empowering Young People to Shape Their Worlds. So through this initial investigation, what we did was we spoke to many different design and making instructors, teachers in many different environments. We visited various design and maker-centered classrooms, and we worked with a cohort of educators from public, private, and charter schools all around Oakland, California. And what we found was when we talked to educators and asked them, well, what do they really want their students to get out or benefit from their classes? What we heard consistently over and over again was we heard educators say, well, when my students see that new shiny thing out in the world, I don't want them to say, where can I go buy that? I want them to say, I can do that. I understand how things are made, and I can make them for myself. So we interpreted this can-do spirit as agency, and this became one of the core elements of our work, supporting student agency through maker-centered learning. So as we engaged in our work and we started to develop our curricular framework, we started to establish two different core concepts that were really foundational, really centers of gravity of this work. And the first thing we needed to do was we needed to translate this sense of agency for the maker sphere. So if you are looking for something fun to do this evening or maybe tomorrow night, you could do a literature review on the concept of agency, and you can look up the concept in philosophy and phenomenology and psychology and feminist studies, and you'll find a lot of interesting things that conflict with each other and contradict with each other, and they may not be useful to you in your classroom. So we needed to look at agency through the lens of making, and we came up with this concept, maker empowerment. And the way that we describe maker empowerment is like this. It's a sensitivity to the design dimension of objects and systems, along with the inclination and capacity to shape one's world by building, tinkering, redesigning, or hacking. Now, this is a very specific kind of definition. It's a very Project Zero kind of definition. Because what it does is it doesn't define a mere skill, but what instead it does is it presents a disposition, a habit of mind, a way of seeing and being in the world. And from a Project Zero perspective, dispositions have three parts. They have capacities, the skills to do something, the ability to do something, but they also have inclinations, the motivation, the want to do something. And then the last part's a little tricky. They have this notion of sensitivity, the alertness to occasion as to when to do something, when to employ a certain type of cognitive skill. as a kind of way in of understanding that, I use a bit of a metaphor. So I've got a little one at home. She's just 2, so, a little Nina like that. And she can't quite clean her room yet, right, because she's little. But one day she'll be able to clean her room. She'll have the capacity to clean her room, right? But she might not always have the inclination or the motivation to clean her room. But sometimes she'll have both the capacity and the inclination to clean her room. She'll know how to do it and she'll want to do it, but she might not always be sensitive or to alert to occasions as when it's time to clean her room. So when you bring those 3 things together, capacity, inclination, and sensitivity, you have what we call a disposition, the Project Zero triadic theory of dispositions. And that's what this definition aims to produce. So it's not as silly as the metaphor I'm using about my daughter cleaning her room, but you get the sense of this whole idea of it's a way of seeing and being in the world. You know how to do something, you want to do it, and you're alert to occasions as to when to do it. So previous Project Zero research has found that the bottleneck to supporting dispositions isn't capacity, it's not inclination, it's sensitivity, knowing when to employ a type of cognitive capacity. And the working theory on why this might be is that young people's lives are too programmed. In math class, they're told to think mathematically. In art class, they're told to think artfully. And at recess, well, they're enculturated to think that that is a time to play or to think playfully. But when are young people given the opportunity to think for themselves? So sensitivity. And that's our second big concept, having a sensitivity to design. And we describe sensitivity to design like this. It's learning to notice and engage with one's physical and conceptual environment by looking closely and reflecting on the design of objects and systems, exploring the complexity of design, and finding opportunity to make objects and systems more effective, more efficient, more ethical, more beautiful, or more fill in the blanks. So these 2 core concepts, maker empowerment and sensitivity to design. And what's exciting for us, what we think is interesting about these 2 definitions, and perhaps what makes the Agency by Design framework for maker-centered learning unique to other pedagogical schemas, is their focus on 2 things, objects and systems. So when we think of Fab Lab learning or design thinking or maker-centered learning, it's easy for us to think of stuff, to think of things, to think of objects. And stuff, things, objects, those are all designed, but so too are systems. And our definitions focus on those 2 things, thinking about both the design of objects, but also the design of systems. And one way into thinking about, systems is to consider an object as a system. So one system I like to play with when I do this sort of discussion is to bring out this bicycle bell. It's just a standard bicycle bell that you'd put on your handlebars and use to let people know you're coming. And we can indeed think of it as an object, but it's also a system. It has this top piece here, it's got this lever, and it's got this mount here that you would use to mount onto your handlebars. So we could think of this as a system that's composed of subsystems, and we could also get a little deeper, and we could just spin off the top and see that there's a mechanism inside there that is even more complex. So there's another subsystem within this system. So we can think of objects as systems and how they function as systems and how a change to one part of that system will affect the greater system. But then we could also think more expansive about that. Like when I attach this bicycle bell to a bicycle, well, then it becomes part of a bigger system. And then when I use that bicycle to commute to work every day, well, then that then becomes part of a bigger system of commuting or transportation. So thinking broadly about systems. So we can do this to, increase our maker sensibilities, increase our design sensibilities, but we can also think about objects and systems to enhance young people's systems thinking. So really engaging in systems thinking through this work. And one way in to think about systems thinking is to, start with objects and then get into systems thinking. But another way is we can start by thinking about systems themselves. And easy and accessible systems that many young people engage with is the school lunch line. So if we look closely and explore the complexity of the school lunch line, the 3rd graders might say, hey, how come the 2nd graders get to go to lunch first and by the time we get there, the pizza's cold? And maybe the fourth graders look at the same system and they say, hey, how come I eat lunch at 9:30 in the morning? So by looking closely and exploring the complexity of the systems around us, we can find opportunity to affect change. So the school lunch line is one. Another accessible system is the dismissal system at a school, which we could certainly look closely and explore complexity and find opportunity to affect change. But we can go bigger. We can look at a system of government. We could look at a system of voting, an electoral system. We could look at a system of institutional racism, like that which we experience here in the United States. And if that's a system that's been designed by people, and we're people too, well, then we can find ways to affect change within that system. So when we take it up to this level, we quickly see that by supporting young people to be systems thinker and really explore complexity on a high level, we're going a lot further than just watching young people print keychains on 3D printers. So printing keychains on 3D printers certainly has its place, but we believe that if we really want to empower young people to shape their worlds, we have to support them in being systems thinkers that understand that anything they make, anything they design, anything they do is all about acting within and upon broader systems. But bigger than that, we also believe that beyond just young people hacking, designing, or redesigning systems, we also want young people to see that they're participants in those systems. So designers, whether they're in Palo Alto design studios or in our public school classrooms, they're never separate from the systems that they're designing for. No designer looks down on a system and says, I maketh for you. Instead, designers, makers, are always a part of the system they designed for. They're participants in those systems. And when we think of design and making in this way, we could see that design and making are a form of what we call cultural participation. So really underscoring the participatory nature of design and making. There's a great article by this MIT researcher named Kevin Slavin that's called Design as Participation. And what's really interesting about this article, or one of my favorite parts of it, is it kicks off with this wonderful anecdote. So the author and a colleague of his from MIT, they're stuck in traffic in NYC, and they're kind of bemoaning their situation. They're frustrated about being in gridlock, and then one of them says something brilliant to the other. We're not stuck in traffic. We are traffic. So this whole idea that designers, makers, are always a part of the systems that they're participating in. They're never separate from it. They're participants in it. Traffic, for example, is nothing we're separate from. It's something we participate in. Climate change isn't something separate from us. It's something we participate in. A system of polarized government isn't something that's separate from us. It's something we participate in. Systems of inequality and oppression aren't things that are separate from us. They're systems that we participate in. And we think it's really important that young people understand if they don't like the way that the systems that they participate in operate, and if we really want to empower them to enact their individual and collective agency, then a great way to start is to change the way they participate in those systems. So for all of us, an elemental way in to enacting our agency, to being empowered as makers, is to think about the roles that we play within the systems we participate in, and think about how we participate in those systems differently to affect change. So the systems that we participate in, I believe, are temporal. They don't have any stopping point or any end point. They have long, complicated histories. They're narratives that are stories. And when my colleague Michael Hansen and I talk about these ideas from the perspective of participatory creativity, which is some of my other work that Jim mentioned, Michael is always quick to point out that in today's world, whenever we talk about creativity, whenever we talk about participation, whenever we talk about design or making for that matter, whenever we talk about the narratives of the systems that we're a part of, we're always faced with an ethical challenge. And the ethical challenge is this: how to be good ancestors. And this presents a really interesting question, a really challenging question. As designers, as makers, as teachers and learners, how can we act today to be good ancestors to the people who will come after us? And how can we set up the conditions so the young people in our classrooms can be good ancestors to the generations that will come after them? This is no small challenge, but it's an important one. And it's one that my colleagues at Project Zero have a proposition for to address. And the proposition is this: by empowering young people to shape their worlds through maker-centered learning, by encouraging them to see that they are participants within the systems that they operate, well, then hopefully they can look critically at the systems they're a part of, explore the complexity of those systems, and find opportunity to affect change. And maybe along the way, they'll also find a way to be good ancestors to the generations that will come after them. Thank you.